These are dry.
How's everybody? We have a good holiday. I know Ian did, because this is the second time I've seen him today. Of course, back to this for others. Two of us in the room I saw today. I'm still working that simple math in my head. Well, y'all energized and ready to tackle the last couple of weeks? Do you have any questions for me before we get today? Yes.
Do we have to do a handout for this report too?
I didn't get one done. It was enough for me just to get what I'm going to talk about today done.
No, do we have to do a handout?
For our
Would you-
next oral report.
Oh, for your oral report. For these, no.
Okay.
I don't think anybody would care to store handouts for a single paper publication. I don't think I've even got that in the rubric, do I?
I don't think so, but we just want to make sure.
Yeah. No handout for this. Usually I've been modifying kind of my expectation for handouts and oral reports over the last couple of years, but usually if it's something that will contribute to the knowledge base of the course for an extended period of time, then I'll require a handout for it. So like in my physiology class, when we're doing endocrine or sensory, that stuff, handouts are useful for something like that. Or like when you guys did taxonomy, that was useful. But for something like this, who cares? The topics or the subject will be interesting, but nobody wants to keep a handout of it for like the rest of their life. That was a long answer to your question. But I like long answers. Anything else? Just a reminder that I will not be here Thursday or Friday. So if you need to connect with me about anything, and it needs to happen this week, it needs to happen before Thursday. So just think about that. You might think about it before my calendar gets too plugged up. Don't forget Friday, my expectation is that you will use this hour for work on your projects. But if you chose another hour during the day to work on the projects, that would be okay with me as well. But that's what we're dedicating the hour to. And then next Tuesday, I will take up a little bit of lab time to get a couple oral reports in. What else? Oh, so lab tomorrow, back to work on projects. I would encourage you to start thinking about wrapping up data collection. So seeing that after today, we will have less than 2 weeks of instruction left. And so you probably want to be thinking about getting to the end of that. Last week was really exciting. You guys were really productive last week. I was proud of you. That was a hard thing. The first time that I went through this course, I thought I had a hard time keeping everybody productive during labs and working on projects. But you guys did a pretty good job of it, so I've been pretty pleased. And we get to see this really exciting little isopod race, which actually worked, and I had no expectation that it would. So show me. Huh? All right. Anything else? So here's what we got going today. I want you to know that I dedicated much of my day yesterday to constructing a talk today on killer bees. Isn't that exciting? I figured I was thinking I'll do something on an invasive invertebrate, and I thought, you know what? Africanized bees sounds cool. And then I'll decide whether I want to do some, I'll see, well, I'm assuming I'm gonna get through all of this today. And then I'll see what I want to do on Wednesday, whether I want to do another one of these or whether we'll do something else, or maybe I'll come up with a brainstorm before we're done today. So just an FYI, since I took the time to develop this content, it will be covered on the exam, so you should seriously. The PowerPoint is on campus. I put it up today. I do not have a handout for this. I can't promise there will be a handout for this because it's sort of spur of the moment, but all really smart college students, so you can handle it, right? Shall we do it? All right. So I got to tell you, the most challenging part of doing this was trying to figure out what the actual genus, species, and subspecies name was for the Africanized bee. You'd think that that's a pretty straightforward thing, but it's really not. Everything that we talk about is Apis mellifera, and as best as I can tell from all of the reading that I did a lot of reading yesterday, okay, that the subspecies is linguistica.
With an N,
Huh?
with an
Linguistica. This is the correct spelling. Linguistica. Okay, so I pronounced it wrong. I'm old. Give me a break. Okay. Now, you want me to count the number of times all of you guys have botched the genus species during this semester? Okay, I'm not even coming close to you folks yet. All right. Okay. Linguistica. All right. That appears to be the right one. Now, what this means is there actually is a European honeybee that is Apis mellifera linguistica. That if you go over to Europe, it's just a European bee. But there is an Africanized version of this that they seem to tag with the same subspecies name. And when you're sorting through literature, trying to figure out what's Africanized and what's not, it's really a lot more challenging than you might think. But anyway, these bees are really interesting, and I actually had to correct some of my own dogma about them as I was going through all of this, but we'll get to that. All right. So the Africanized honeybee, they were created, and yes, they were created in Brazil, 1956, 1957, by a biologist by the name of Warwick Kerr. And what Warwick Kerr was trying to do is he was trying to help out agriculture in tropical environment. The typical European honeybee, that is also an exotic species, by the way, was not really adapted for really warm temperatures. And so they were not the best pollinators in the world in a tropical environment. And so what Kerr did is he brought over an African subspecies of Apis mellifera, the subspecies Scutellatae. We'll just go with that, okay? But that's a subspecies that they brought over, and then he was trying to cross it with a standard European honeybee, with the hope of developing a bee that did well in warm climates, because the African subspecies did really well in warm climates, but had some of the efficiency of the standard European honeybee when it comes to pollination and honey production. Did you have a question?
I did. It was kind of just answered, but I just want to ask it more explicitly, I guess. Do you have any ideas of the efficiency of the African subspecies that would make it be like the need to cross, I guess?
Yeah, the African subspecies they were subject to a whole lot of predation over in Africa. And so they have adapted to be really aggressive, and we'll go through some of the characteristics of them in a bit. But they would not, if just the African subspecies would have worked itself, they would have just brought that over here and used that, and just released it. But the idea was they were trying to get the best of both worlds. They were really trying to get from the African subspecies was this warm temperature tolerance. And as you'll see, we'll look at some genetic data a little bit later, they got more than they bargained for. Okay. So anyway, the European honeybees were better pollinators and better honey producers. And so, like I said, they were really just trying to get this temperature tolerance from this cross. Well, an accident happened. An accident happened, and 26 queens, they know exactly how many, 26 queens escaped, went out into the forest, and immediately started crossing with the local European honeybee. And the resulting hybrids were very, very good, very, very efficient. They outcompeted the local bees and basically took everything over really, really fast. And over time, this hybrid expanded in pretty much all directions, outcompeting the regular European honeybee, which, as I said, was also exotic. Yes, Emily?
So the 26 queens were the African subspecies?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So the African species is the same, except they're from Africa as the ones that are local?
Yes.
Okay.
There are different subspecies.
Okay.
Okay. So there are something, oh, I forget what it was, it's either 26 or 28 different subspecies of Apis mellifera. So you got to keep score.
And the European honeybees are different than the Apis mellifera?
No, they're all of these bees are Apis mellifera. Okay. Okay. Their only difference is they're different subspecies.
Okay.
Okay. And so this Ligustica is one subspecies. There's another one that is over here that starts with a C. I don't remember the name, but it's a third subspecies of European honeybee that the African can also cross with. But anyway, it gets a little complex. But anyway, these 26 queens basically went out and hybridized with the local version of the European honeybee, and they created these hybrids, which ended up being aggressive and very competitive and outcompeted the local European honeybee. Now, a note here. Tropical beekeepers actually looked at this as a win. Believe it or not, I had never heard this before. But they looked at this as a win because these hybrid bees, did indeed do better in the tropical environment. And their honey production and pollination were adequate. They were more aggressive. But overall, just in terms of doing what Kerr had set out to do, even though what was ended up being produced was not exactly what he was trying to cross, it ended up accomplishing the goal. They created a rather aggressive hybridized species or subspecies. But for these tropical beekeepers, it all worked for them. Okay, so I'm going to show you two videos right now. And one is an older video that's going to give you a perspective. And then I'll show you a more recent video that comes from an organization that studies these bees that will perhaps put some things into perspective for you. I have to start this.
For untold millennia, the great rainforests of Central America have been kept alive by one of the tiniest and least understood of creatures. But now, their fragile world has been invaded by an alien species from Africa, the result of a scientific experiment gone horribly wrong. One man, entomologist David Rubik, believes these imported African bees are edging out the native honeybees and damaging the rainforest. He's searching for evidence.
At stake here is the future of rainforest in Americas. Ardent solar rainforest remains in its pollinators and the things that make all the plants reproduce.
It all started in Brazil in 1957. Scientists were studying an aggressive type of bee from Africa, but a few of them escaped. It was a mistake. It would have enormous consequences. The African bees proved extremely adaptable to their new home. Their numbers soared, and they formed voracious swarms that spread throughout South America and up to the southwestern United States. Easily agitated and quick to attack, they were dubbed killer bees, known to sting humans to death. Swarms react faster than other honeybees and have been known to chase victims for a quarter of a mile. But Rubik says they pose a far greater threat to the fragile rainforest than they do to people.
This is one of the millions. These bees have done something no other bee ever did. These things have sucked up most of the resources that are out there for bees and for other animals too, not just bees, as flowers for food, birds, bats, butterflies, other things take the same food. And it's not just here and there, it's really everywhere. All the vast forest areas, you think of this absolute wildlife preserves that have been violated by this bee. This bee doesn't belong in any of them. It lives in all of them. It's not going to go away.
Can native South American honeybees survive the onslaught of their killer cousins? Abandoned native bee nests suggest it's a losing battle.
The disturbing reality is that it is not a natural part of this community, yet it has become part of nature. And ironically, man has put it there, but man can't take it away.
No one knows if the native bees will survive the alien onslaught or ultimately perish. But Rubik intends to continue monitoring the fate of this little native. It's been a staple of the rainforest since the time of the ancients.
How did they exactly count the 26?
Are they what?
The 26 bees, how do they know it was 26? I don't know, I'm kind of a little lost.
Because they brought, I want to say it was 35 queens over from Africa. So they knew how many queens that they had. And I guess 26 of them got away.
Do you know how?
Yeah. Somebody just left the barn door open.
Welcome to the Natural History Institute's YouTube channel. I'm Jordan and I'm a honeybee researcher. And today I'm going to be talking to you about Africanized honeybees, otherwise known as killer bees. So Africanized honeybees, what are they? Well, first I'm going to tell you a little bit about our honeybees, the ones you know and love, the European honeybee. So European honeybees are non-native to the United States. They're actually from Europe, as the name implies. They're Apis mellifera, and they were brought here to help pollinate our agriculture. And the reason this is necessary, you're probably thinking, why can't native pollinators help pollinate our agriculture? Which is a great question, and something that we do need to consider in agriculture today. However, the reason we need honeybees is that in America, we tend to lean towards this monocrop agriculture system, which means that we plant a bunch of one crop all over a huge area of land. And the thing about crops and the thing about bees is that bees pollinate flowers. Bees eat nectar, bees eat pollen, and so they want the flowers of these plants. And if you have all the same plant, they're all going to flower at roughly the same time, which means that bees can't get enough food. So they would only be eating for maybe 2 or 3 weeks in a year, which obviously isn't sustainable, which is why we have to bring in honeybees. So honeybees, as you know, and you can see a honeybee, can be kept in colonies. They can be quote unquote domesticated, which means that we can keep them and we can move them wherever we want to move them. And so say if you have a big bloom in California in February with the almonds, you can take a commercial beekeeper can take all of their colonies to California for 2 weeks, and then they can move on, move to the next crop, move to the next bloom. So this is really, helpful because we can pollinate these monocrop agricultures, and that's why everyone's scared about losing the bees, is because with our agriculture system today, it wouldn't work if we didn't have a pollinator that we could carry around to these blooms. However, if we did have more pollination system like would be naturally present, where you have a lot of different flowers, kind of these like flower strips that have a bunch of different native flowers around your crops, it would be more sustainable for native pollinators, which is one thing to think about when we think about pollinators, because the pollinator decline isn't just worried about honeybees. Honeybees are important to us, but honeybees are not native. And there are over, 20,000 species of bees, and a lot of these bees are native. Like here I am in Texas, and that means that we have about 400 different species of native bees that we're not using because they're not domesticatable, but they're also declining. And so we're worried about all of these bees. So, if you at home want to plant any native flowers, help out the bees. That's a good thing, always a good thing. But back to the main story. So we have these colonies of European honeybees, like you see behind me. So why European honeybees? European honeybees there are actually 7 different species of honeybees, I should mention that. European honeybees are relatively nice. They collect a lot of honey, and they like to stay in one place, and they're good at overwintering. So in colder climates, European honeybees, 10 out of 10. But when we came to America, obviously we have some cold climates here, but we also have some warm climates, especially in South America. So when honeybees were brought over to the Americas, South America didn't have any of these pollinators because it doesn't have this cold winter. So in Brazil, they decided, well, maybe we can engineer our own pollinator. So they brought over African honeybees, which are the same species as European honeybees. They're just a different quote unquote race of honeybee. So the Africanized honeybee actually faces more predators than the European honeybee, such as the honey badger, which I'm sure you've heard of. So this leads to the fact that these African honeybees need to be better at dealing with predators, which means that they're more aggressive. Because the more predators you have, the more aggressive you're going to want to be. The other thing that it means is that these bees are much more likely to up and leave their hive. They just abscond, they just get out of there. Because if predators attacking, they want to leave, they want to get out of there. So they're much more likely to do that, and they don't keep as much honey in their hive because they don't overwinter, so they don't need the honey stores that European honeybees do. Which is all fine and good, it's working well for them, right? But Brazil, we in South America wanted to have some honeybees that could pollinate there and not need to have a winter, not need to overwinter, not be European honeybees, right? So they brought over some African honeybee queens, and they were setting up a breeding program to breed with European honeybees to create maybe a kind of bee that would work better for warmer climates. And as some science experiments are wont to do, the queens actually escaped from the facility in Brazil and got hybridized with the European honeybee males. So this actually led to this kind of, it was surprising how successful these African honeybee queens were. So they mated with European drones and managed to move northward and southward in South America. And they've come all through like Panama and up into Mexico. And in the 80s, they got to the United States. So that's where all the hype, the like old 80s films about killer bees come from, is from these Africanized bees. And we call them Africanized because they're hybrids. The African bees come from Africa, European bees come from Europe, and Africanized bees are hybrid European African bees. So it's a lot of fun. And if you just want a little bit of background here in the United States, we tend to keep, this is what the race is called, Apis mellifera rustica. And the Africanized honeybee race is called Apis mellifera scutellata, just for reference. So Africanized bees actually look no different than European bees because they're the same species. So on inspection, visual inspection, you cannot tell the difference. They don't live in hives any differently than European bees do. They're just really not any different, except for that they are more aggressive, they swarm more frequently, and they are more resistant to some honeybee parasites and pests, which is actually really important. So these Africanized honeybees tend to be much more resistant to the parasitic mite Varroa destructor. So Varroa destructor is a huge detrimental mite in the honeybee systems, and one of the biggest stressors they face today. And these Africanized honeybees are actually much better at dealing with it, which is something that comes into play maybe later. So these Africanized bees got to the United States, and they've been hybridizing with European bees ever since. So here I'm in, like I said, Texas, and here we do have Africanized colonies. And the interesting thing about our apiary is some of our Africanized colonies are actually nicer than our European colonies. So this just means that the hype is a little bit overstated, right? You're not going to get killed by Africanized honeybees unless you go knock their home down and stamp it, right? So they just don't do that. But other than that, you have to look at the mitochondrial DNA to tell the difference between these kinds of bees. So they're really not that crazy dangerous, but they are harder to keep in beekeeping because they are much more likely to leave the colony and they're meaner on average. So there is this pushback from beekeepers that don't want to keep Africanized honeybees, which is understandable. But there's also this reason that you want to, which is this varroa mite resistance. So it would be interesting if we could engineer some sort of hybridized line that is maybe not quite as neat, but is maybe more resistant to mites. So don't be scared of Africanized bees. The biggest thing that they're going to do is maybe get a little sting in, which isn't very fun, but you'll be fine. Nobody thinks that you should be worried about Africanized bees. Be nice to the bees. Bees are important, and plant some wildflowers for the native bees while you're at it. And with that, I just want to say thank you for watching this video and for watching the Natural History Institute's YouTube channel. Go ahead and give it a subscribe and comment and all that good stuff, because Natural History Institute is amazing and doing really big things. So yeah, they deserve all the support they can get, and I hope to maybe see you again sometime to talk more about bees. So thanks.
Okie dokie. So, see a couple of different perspectives right there. It's not 100% correct that you can't tell them apart visually, that you need mitochondrial DNA, because in reality, there are some small morphological differences like wing length. The Africanized bees tend to have shorter wings, and so if you're out measuring wings, you may be able to separate them that way. They tend to be smaller in size. So there are some morphological differences that have been pointed out in some of the literature that I have looked at. But anyway, here is a table that kind of gives you some basic differences between Africanized and European honeybees. So in this column here, we have the Africanized trait, and over here we have the European. So in terms of their nesting behavior, Do they nest? Do they have open and exposed nests? Africanized bees do that commonly, apparently, which you never see or rarely see in European bees. In fact, one of the things that came across is that the Africanized bees tend to be much more versatile in their nesting habits. Okay, location of nests, variable, I think I just said that. Any kind of cavity, including in ground. So, I mean, they'll actually go into a gopher hole and build a nest in a gopher hole. Okay, and specifically in holes in the ground were nests that animals had made, and this actually increases their chance of interacting with humans, because if they go into a hole in your backyard, then you're going to interact with them. Okay. European bees prefer large cavities, beehives, hollow trees, hollow walls, and you rarely ever see them nesting in the ground. Tendency to abandon nests. It's pretty high for the Africanized bee. So they'll abandon the nest, on a whim and move. And that's not something that we see in the European bee, which actually is as close to being a domesticated bee as you can get. And in fact, beekeepers, can move the nests around and the bees hang around. And this is something that's a little more challenging with the Africanized bees. Okay, so swarming rate, okay, high for the Africanized bee and much lower for the quote unquote nicer European bee. Yeah.
Sorry for this English question, but what is the swarming rate in Geneva? Like, is that them abandoning their nest, or is it?
They're more likely to chase you.
Oh, okay.
So if you irritate them, you're more likely to tick off the whole nest, and they're likely to come after you.
Oh.
Yeah.
I've heard that with killer bees that they send out a signal to other bees for swarming. Is that related to them swarming
Oh,
more, or
absolutely.
do all bees do that?
Yeah. No, I suspect to at some level, all honeybees do that. I don't know about all bees, because not all bees exist in these huge, humongous colonies that honeybees will exist in. But all honeybees certainly will. They have a lot of forms of communication which can cause bees to group or not to group. But the Africanized bees are very aggressive about this. Okay, stinging behavior. Okay, intense. They will defend their nest up to a distance of 100 yards away, as compared to a maximum of 20 yards in the European. Okay. So it's a lot harder to bug a European version as opposed to an Africanized version. Africanized version have a quicker development time, 19 to 20 days as opposed to 21 days. Honey production, acceptable once beekeepers adapt. And that beekeepers adapt is a key term here. In that, apparently you can do just fine with these Africanized bees, but you've got to kind of change your habits with them. The honey production in Africanized bees is not quite as high, but it is acceptable. And like I said, beekeepers in warm climates love these bees because they are better suited to the climate. Okay. Pollination, they're fairly effective pollinators, but I like this, risky for farm laborers, and that's because of their aggressiveness. Okay. Tolerance of mechanized handling, acceptable if beekeepers limit hives to one per stand or pallet. I'm not exactly sure what that means. But what I'm guessing is you just can't have the hives as densely packed as you would a regular European honeybee. And so, you have some behaviors that you've got to change about how you do your beekeeping if you have Africanized bees. And I'm not sure what industry standard means for either of these two things. But you can see there is a substantial difference between them, but the idea that the Africanized bees are going to basically destroy agriculture because we're no longer going to get effective pollination or anything like that probably is not true. And I'll show you a map in a moment which suggests that we've got them up here in Oregon now. So, questions? All right. So we mentioned that the goal in hybridizing these bees was to produce bees that perform better at higher temperatures. Well, one of the things that they found when these hybridizations occurred is that you got a lot more than that. So this here is a plot of along chromosome 11, and the focus of this particular paper was on this chromosome 11. And what you see when you look throughout most of the chromosome, that there is far less European ancestry when you look at the sequences as opposed to African ancestry. So everything above the blue here in gray would be African ancestry. The one exception for that was this stretch, right? This small stretch along chromosome 11, which is why I stuck this up here, which tended to be dominated by European alleles or European sequence. And I'll get to the reason for that in a second. But even with that, in Brazil, they found that when you look at the genetics, the genome of these hybrids was 84% African, as opposed to European. So clearly, selection favored the African sequences in the genome. Okay. So I already said that. What's interesting is this region along chromosome 11 here, which tends to just have this unusually high amount of European sequence. It is a region of chromosome 11 that seems tied to reproduction, and specifically ovary size, as well as foraging behavior. So there are perhaps some traits that the European bees can add to the mix that that selection does favor in the hybridization, but it's not a lot, at least in Brazil, because I'm going to show you a little different take on this in the next slide. Any questions about this? All right. So here's another study that's more recent, where they were looking at the proportion, basically, of African versus European sequences in bees ranging from Argentina up to California. And just to kind of clue you in on this, on these two bars down here, these two bars represent a variety of bees that they sequenced from both California. This top one's California, this bottom one is Argentina right here. And these squares right here represent where they got the bees from, and several populations of bees. And if you look up at the top up here, I've color coded this for you. So the A is the pink, which is African ancestry. C here is purple, which is Eastern European ancestry, and the green is Western European ancestry. And what I want you to note is how different the Argentinian Africanized bees are compared to the California. And basically what the authors of this paper argued is that as you moved more towards California, the proportion of Africanized sequence started to decline. And you can see that there's a lot less pink. And these each one of these little symbols down here, I know they're hard to see, is a different population. So you can see the populations run from being, you know, a little less than half African up to almost no African. And when you look at the Argentinian population, you can see it's predominantly African, except for some populations that are sitting out here somewhere. Okay. And what the authors of this particular study suggested was that what you're seeing, particularly up here in California, is perhaps the bees starting to run into a thermal wall. They're starting to hit climates that are a little colder than what the Africanized bees do best at. And so you're starting to see a shift away from this predominance of African sequence in the genome. Even so, it's not like the African sequences disappear, so there clearly are still some portions of the genome that selection probably is favoring from the African honeybee. Questions? Now, from the same study, here are a couple more graphs. And so here is a graph of the proportion of African ancestry as a function of degrees of latitude from the equator. And again, you can see this pretty steady decline as you move away from the equator. Right. And then this plot here, remember I told you that wing length was a phenotypic identifier for the Africanized bees? You can see here, and this axis is kind of upside down, so you got to look at the, you know, bigger is down here, and smaller is up here. You can see that as we move away from the equator again, that the wing size starts to get bigger, which would suggest a greater European influence on the morphology of the bees. Now, the authors suggested that this is potentially these Africanized bees running into a thermal wall and are having, and selection is choosing a different set of basically alleles for these Africanized bees as the climate gets cooler. Is there any alternative explanations for this?
Where this comes in at like starting point, they're just like naturally limited as they leave other.
Yeah, and that's the first thing that I thought of, is that, well, you know, as these populations are moving away, are there some reproductive dynamics that are going on that's just simply starting to dilute out the Africanized influence of these hybrids? I don't know whether that's true or not. It could be a combination. It could be a combination of both. So I don't know. But clearly, when you look at an Africanized bee in South America, it doesn't look anything like an Africanized bee here in North America. Any questions about this slide? Pretty interesting stuff, huh? All right, so one of the things that the authors of that previous study suggested is that bees were running into, you know, a thermal wall. In other words, it's getting a little too cold for an Africanized version of a honeybee. And I actually spent hours yesterday looking for studies that tested the thermal tolerance of Africanized bees versus basic European honeybees. And as much as they'd like to tell you that the Africanized bees clearly are warm temperature and the European are more cooler temperature bees, if there are studies out there, I can't find them, and I'm really good at finding them. And so I pulled a few things out here to share with you guys, and we'll see where it goes. So here is a 1993 study, and most of these studies are very old. They're not recent at all. Where what they did is they grew some, or they subjected some Africanized versus European bees at just 15 degrees, which is not horribly cold. And they ran them out, 11 days, and they measured the amount of living biomass that remained after those 11 days. And when you look at these data, there's roughly twice as much biomass of European bees left as there is of the Africanized bees after those 11 days. Okay. And so that amounted to, 10, 20 grams over here, 10 grams over there. So clearly the European bees tolerated 15 degrees better than the Africanized bees did. Whether that turns really into thermal tolerance or not, who knows? Here was another, I think this is actually the same study that I took the previous graph out of. But this one was kind of interesting. So what they looking at here is the ability of these bees to warm the hive. And so if you look down here, you can see what temperatures the different colors represent down here. And anything that starts with an E is a European hive. Anything that starts with an A is an African hive here. So there's 2 Europeans and 2 African hives here. And clearly, when you look at 12.5 degrees, the European hives seem to be warmer. The bees seem to have the capacity to keep the hive more uniformly warm than the Africanized bees do. It's a little more of a mixed bag when you get down to below 0 here for both of them. And interpreting this was a little bit of a challenge, but what I think may be going on here is that for these European bees, a lot of them may just be kind of going quiet and just tolerating the cold temperatures. Much more so than the Africa bees, which may be trying to warm things up, but not very successfully. And I don't know that we'll get to it today because I'm almost out of time. But on Wednesday, I'll actually show you some data on cold tolerance. So here is a study that I found. And this is one that I had in a little bit of difficulty interpreting what kind of bees were actually being studied. So this was a study of feral versus domesticated bees. And they're the right genus, species, and subspecies. So, I'm going on the presumption that the feral is Africanized, the domesticated is the European, but take it with a grain of salt. What this shows is that when you look at these are measurements of CT max here. You can see that CT max in the feral bees is higher than in the domesticated bees. And the other interesting thing is the feral bees show a little bit of seasonal variation in CT max, which means that they may be adjusting for periods of warm versus cold temperature. And compared to the domesticated bees. And down here you can see changes in the temperature. So you can see temperatures highest here when CT max is highest, and lowest here when CT max is lowest. That same seasonal variation did not seem to occur in the domesticated bees. You can see a little bit of an increase out here, but for the most part, it's pretty flat throughout the entire year. All right, questions about this slide? Okay. All right, you know what? I think I'll stop there because I don't think I can explain that before I'm out of time. I will pick this up on Wednesday. So here's what we're gonna do on Wednesday. Rather than me go and build another one of these that I probably couldn't finish on Wednesday. What I think I would like you all to do is go out and see if you can find adaptations in Africanized or European bees that are outside of thermal tolerance and parasite tolerance, because I'm going to talk about parasite tolerance before I'm done. And you guys can help me paint a bigger picture of what these Africanized bees are all about. Is that fair enough? Go find me some interesting facts and we'll have a little discussion when we get done. We'll be on to rules. Fair enough? All right. You guys have a great rest of your day. You're welcome.